A woman who had a whole life ahead of her. Everybody was jittery, wondering what had happened to her.
Really a very dangerous person. This is the real whodunit.
Crimes don't really happen here. She'd been placed inside a suitcase. This was a brutal, horrific murder and an awful way to leave the body of a teenage girl.
I've been a criminal lawyer for over 30 years and I've never dealt with a case like this before.
To have 3 trials is very rare, but the case was of such importance.
He would have walked free. And given what he had done before, we were in no doubt that he was a dangerous man.
Nestled in the southwest corner of Kent, the so-called Garden of England, this is the leafy, historic town of Royal Tunbridge Wells.
I would describe Tunbridge Wells as a safe family sort of location, wealthy and middle class.
There's a really low level of crime in the area. I feel very safe walking around at night.
People enjoy a very peaceful life on the whole and generally go about their business.
Tunbridge Wells is your archetypal Middle England. It's picturesque, it's surrounded by beautiful countryside. Crimes don't really happen here.
But that picture postcard image was about to be shattered. Kent police receive a call about a missing person, 17-year-old Terry Edmonds. The day before, Easter Monday, Terry had arranged to meet her boyfriend, but she never showed up.
This was really out of character. She stayed in contact with her boyfriend regularly. She texted him on the hour almost, and he did the same back to her. They sent multiple texts to each other each day. So the fact that she did not text him was really unusual and set the alarm bells ringing.
Terry's boyfriend sent her 20 texts, but she never replied to any of them.
Her boyfriend got concerned, tried to phone her, didn't get any response, and then alerted her mum. And her mum then reported her missing to the police.
This disappearance was out of the ordinary for the happy-go-lucky teen.
She was bright and intelligent. She had 8 A-grade GCSEs. She was fiercely independent. She was a teenager who was turning into a young woman.
She decided to spread her wings, leaving home at just 16 to live in a housing association hostel in the centre of Tunbridge Wells.
She had aspirations to be a nurse. She was waiting to join college. She was too young to start training at that point to be a nurse. But from everything that we've heard, she was a caring, lovely, independent and headstrong, her mother said, but a young woman who had a whole life ahead of her.
She was very popular, lots of friends, was a girly girl. They described her as always liked to look nice, took care of herself.
But those friends were all equally puzzled at her disappearance, the only lead police have. She was 5 miles away in the town of Tonbridge when she last made contact.
She was in touch with her boyfriend, and she'd been to Tunbridge for the day, and she said, "I'm in Tunbridge Park, I'll be coming back soon." And then she didn't arrive back in Tunbridge Wells. So we started doing some searching in Tunbridge, because that's where she was last heard of.
So police cast their net wide, searching parks, old buildings, rivers, anywhere the missing teen could be. But the trail runs cold. With no other options, police appeal to the public and press for help. Her disappearance makes a big splash across the local media.
Tunbridge Wells is a place where crime doesn't normally happen. It's a tranquil place. So when a teenage girl goes missing, it becomes a news story. And Terry was just 17 years old. She had a mother, she had a boyfriend. So that's a story of local significance.
Terry going missing was really shocking for the people of Tunbridge Wells, and people were extremely worried. Everybody was jittery, wondering where she was and what had happened to her.
It's a closed community, people talk, so if there's something that does happen, then word does spread quite quickly.
It's 10 days since Terry went missing, and still no word from her. The family makes another desperate appeal to the public.
As time passed, we get more and more concerned when someone doesn't stay in contact. And what we were really more concerned about with this case was she'd not been in touch with her mum. Her mum would tell us that Terry always would respond to her. Even if it was I don't want to talk to you, she would get a response. So when that didn't happen, obviously the concerns were raised.
Concerns are also rising across her close-knit hometown of Tunbridge Wells.
I think as the days went by and Terry was missing, fear started to grow that something terrible had happened to her. And there was a big community effort. There were posters everywhere. The taxi drivers all carried flyers. And there was even an information point by police for two reasons. One, to gather information, and other reason to try and reassure people, because there was a lot of worry at that time.
In the meantime, police have been trawling through hours of CCTV footage close to where she was last seen, in the nearby town of Tonbridge. Suddenly, there's a breakthrough. Terry is spotted at Tonbridge railway station on the day of her disappearance.
When we checked the CCTV, we actually found that she had actually got on the train to go to Tunbridge Wells. And then checking the CCTV at Tunbridge Wells railway station, we found that she had got off the train at Tunbridge Wells. So at that point, the searching moved from Tunbridge to Tunbridge Wells.
The investigation suddenly picks up pace in the hunt to find the missing teen. Police now draw up a search plan using this new CCTV sighting.
The last sighting of Terry Edmonds was at Tunbridge Wells rail station, where she got off the train at 6:23. So she walked across here, and Terry was never seen again.
Investigators plan a search grid around this last known location. The hunt leads to the supermarket car park opposite the station. On the 12th day of Terry's disappearance, there are reports of frenzied police activity on wasteland next to the car park.
This area was absolutely cordoned off. There were police everywhere, police vehicles, so the public had absolutely no entry. They closed the car park off while forensics were working at the scene, so this was an absolute no-go area for the public.
The search teams had made a grim discovery.
The suitcase was discovered under a vehicle ramp going into the car park. And when the searching officers opened it, they found a young lady's body. She was in a fetal position in that suitcase.
This young woman appeared to have been mercilessly strangled.
She'd been placed inside a suitcase that had been well hidden behind a wall, a squalid, desolate and dirty spot to leave a young girl's body. This was a brutal, horrific murder.
When the suitcase was found with a body inside, I think it was the news that everyone had been dreading in a way. But I think most of us had that sinking feeling that it was going to be Terry.
Police in Tunbridge Wells have been searching for missing teen Terry Edmonds. On the 12th day of her disappearance, they make a gruesome discovery under a car park ramp close to the station. The body of a teenage girl is found stuffed into a suitcase. She'd been strangled.
This was a brutal, horrific murder, a desperately tragic, an awful way to leave the body of a teenage girl. The person who killed her had no sense of humanity to leave a teenager in such a position.
The body in the suitcase was found behind a wall, just here. Immediately, police taped off the area, and there were lots and lots of police officers, forensic teams, sifting through the area looking for evidence.
Police are in no doubt that the body in the dark green suitcase is tragically Terry's.
We had to go through formal identification process, but we knew from the description that that was Terry in the suitcase.
The next day, the body is formally identified as Terry Edmonds. The news rocks the idyllic town of Tunbridge Wells.
To hear that she'd been murdered and her body found in such an awful way, stuffed into a suitcase, I think people were absolutely horrified and so sad.
Terry's disappearance quickly turned into a murder investigation, and that really sent shockwaves through the close-knit community of Tunbridge Wells. It scared people, primarily because she was a young teenage girl, but also because there are many parents in Tunbridge Wells who feared that there could be a killer on the loose.
To quell residents' fears, police presence is stepped up across the town. Investigators hit the streets, carrying out door-to-door inquiries for any leads on the killer.
Kent Police followed a lot of lines of inquiry. They had 50 police officers working on it. They were talking to quite a few people in relation to her disappearance and death.
The post-mortem reveals horrifying injuries to the young teen.
The details of the post-mortem were shocking, they were horrific, and as a seasoned journalist, it was upsetting. Terry had endured a really brutal and violent attack. She had been physically overpowered. She'd been raped, and she'd suffered a number of injuries, and her last moments would have been truly horrific.
The post-mortem examination showed that she had grazes on her back and she'd been strangled.
Terry was strangled by a scarf that she was wearing. She looped it through, and by pulling it tight, he'd strangled her. She had some facial injuries where she'd taken some strikes to the face as well.
And she was probably smothered with a pink sheet, which was found away from the scene.
Blood is found on this mysterious pink sheet, which is retrieved with Terry's trainers and her cigarette lighter in a pile of rubbish close to her body. They're sent off for analysis at the lab. But it's the suitcase that police hope could be the key to finding her killer.
Once the body had been removed, then the suitcase itself was considered as a crime scene. And that crime scene was essentially packaged up carefully and submitted to the Forensic Science Laboratory for examination.
Police hope testing for traces of DNA could provide answers to some of their biggest questions.
Initially, we were looking to see where the suitcase had come from. Could we have an owner of the suitcase? Could that be a big clue for us?
Whilst the lab pores over the suitcase, the spotlight falls on the person who raised the alarm. Terry's boyfriend. New evidence comes to light about a fallout with his girlfriend.
The last person that the police were initially aware of that had spoken to Terry was her boyfriend, and they'd had a row. Bearing in mind, most murders are committed by people that are known to the victim.
Samples of the boyfriend's DNA are also found on Terry's body.
Police investigating the disappearance of 17-year-old Terry Edmonds have today made an arrest.
Detectives arrest Terry's boyfriend at his home in the nearby village of Hadlow. He's taken in for questioning.
He was living with his mother in a house in Hadlow, and when he was arrested, police went to his property, uniformed officers were stationed outside, and forensic officers went into his house and conducted a search all night.
But eventually, this would draw a blank.
They did release him without charge because it was quite clear he was not involved in any way, shape or form. And it was clear he was at work, and there was no way that he was involved.
With the boyfriend eliminated, police focus on the suitcase. Forensic scientists have been putting their star piece of evidence under the microscope, and the suitcase has yielded a significant lead.
We recovered various samples, including a sample of DNA from the retractable handle. And the retractable handle had like a little switch on it. So we recovered material from that switch, and that DNA profile matched an individual that was of interest to the police investigation. That was a light bulb moment in the investigation, because we felt that, you know, that would lead investigatively to the identification of a suspect.
So police make a second arrest, and the man is brought in for questioning. It's a turning point for the investigation.
That suspect, in this case, turned out to be the previous owner of the suitcase. Now, that person then gave information to the police to say, that is my suitcase, but I gave that suitcase away. I believe, actually, it was given to the Salvation Army, so a charity donation.
As the police hit another brick wall, the clock's still ticking, and there's a brutal murderer on the run.
Clearly a dangerous person, clearly a very dangerous person, and trying to get them. This is the real whodunit.
So detectives have to go back to the drawing board, refocusing their efforts on the location where Terry was found. The car park. Through their inquiries, investigators discover it was often part of her regular journey through town.
And she used the car park as a short cut through, if you like, to make her way back to the hostel that she was staying at, that was just at the rear of the car park.
Though nothing on the police's CCTV trawl shows Terry's last suspected steps through it.
There was no CCTV in the car park itself, but there was CCTV at the exit, and she wasn't seen to leave. So we checked everything, double-checked it, triple-checked it. We couldn't see her leave.
Police can now prove Terry never left the car park, which means she must have been killed there. They double down their efforts to find out who else could have been using it on the Easter Monday evening she went missing.
We had to look wider, and we were looking at other people. And within the car park in Tunbridge Wells, there were some people that we called the rough sleepers. They were homeless people who'd found certain areas of the car park, the stairwells of the car park, that they used as accommodation. And on those stairwells, certain people sleeping rough there on cardboard mattresses, sleeping bags, duvets, that kind of thing. We started looking at those people to see if there's anyone there was of interest to us. We made inquiries to the rough sleepers in the car park. Did any of them own a suitcase? And they all denied it.
But intelligence from an officer on the beat suggests otherwise.
A local police officer told us that he knew of one person who had a suitcase. And we looked through our records and we'd spoken to that person, he denied it. So there was a reason why he denied being the owner of a suitcase.
With their suspicions raised, detectives head straight back to the car park. They need to find the rough sleeper whose story doesn't quite stack up.
We then went and spoke to him again. He said he did have a suitcase, but someone had stolen it, and it was kept in the stairwell. Someone had emptied his clothes out from it, and the suitcase had gone.
But for investigators, something about his story doesn't seem right. So they arrest him. Perhaps this new suspect could blow the case wide open. In Tunbridge Wells, 17-year-old Terry Edmonds has been found dead. She was sexually assaulted and dumped inside a suitcase next to a car park. Police have made another arrest. A local homeless man has been brought in for questioning. 21-year-old Philip Bell.
He confirmed that the suitcase that Terry was in was the suitcase that he had previously owned. And we asked him more about it, but he insisted that the suitcase had been stolen.
Nevertheless, there were little glitches in his story that were starting to cause the police concern, and that's when they started to kind of zone in on him as a suspect.
Although police can find no evidence that their victim, Terry, knew Bell, they realise this isn't the first time he's had a brush with the law.
Philip Bell came to Tunbridge Wells from Salisbury, and he sort of set up a base in Tunbridge Wells.
He had left school at the age of 15 without any qualifications and had started living on the street. He got involved in petty crime. He became a drug dealer.
Philip Bell had been in Tunbridge Wells for about 2 years, living rough, and he was heavily into drugs, so cannabis, crack, speed, solvents. So he was a big drug taker and just drifting around, really.
And Bell's transient lifestyle puts him at the location where police believe Terry met her fate. The car park. Through their inquiries, police are told Bell had set up home on the landing of one of the disused stairwells. In the basement of that stairwell, forensic investigators find something sinister, with a link to Terry.
She had some dirt, some debris on her inside her clothes that was directly linked to the bottom of the stairwell. And at the bottom of that stairwell, her blood was found.
The fact that her blood, her being in that stairwell and injured was really important because it identified the attack site, essentially.
So police have found their murder scene. But during questioning, Bell denies he was ever in the stairwell or even the car park at the time when Terry disappeared.
He told them that he had nothing to do with Terry's murder and he hadn't even seen her.
However, when investigators seize his clothes, something raises their suspicions.
Having taken his trousers, they noticed that he had grazing on his knees, and that was consistent with him being astride Terry when he assaulted her and grazing his knees.
Now, he said he'd done that playing football. Now, we interviewed all the people that he used to play football with, and none of them ever remembered him actually falling down or hurting his knees whilst playing football in the time frame we were talking about. So again, that disproved part of what he was saying.
Although the case against Bell is beginning to build, the evidence is largely circumstantial. Detectives still don't have enough proof to charge their prime suspect with murder.
With there being no other evidence at that particular time, we had to release him on bail whilst we carried out other inquiries.
It's a blow for the investigation. Just days later, searching for answers about her daughter's death, Terry's mum once again makes an emotional public appeal.
I am begging you, please, if anybody knows anything, however little, get in touch, because anything to help catch the person that's done this will help.
Over the next months, detectives work 24/7 in the hope to get the potentially dangerous Philip Bell back behind bars. They doggedly trawl through hours and hours of the town's CCTV footage for anything that could link him to Terry's disappearance. Suddenly, something catches their eye.
Sometime later, we were looking at more of the CCTV, and we found Philip Bell. We'd found him walking past the railway station and going into the car park just a few seconds after we suspect Terry had gone in.
Although we never saw him and Terry together, it was clear from the timing that he followed her in moments after she went into the car park.
Police now have proof that their suspected killer and his victim would have crossed paths. And that's not all.
We then, about an hour later, we had CCTV of him leaving the car park. So that sort of brought us to a conclusion that she'd gone in, he'd gone in shortly afterwards, he'd come out, but she hadn't. So that added to our suspicions that he could have been responsible.
For the investigation team, this is really big. The new CCTV blows apart Bell's claim that he wasn't at the murder scene at the time of Terry's attack.
Initially, when Philip Bell was arrested and interviewed in May, he denied that he'd returned to the car park. Although there was no CCTV or eyewitness accounts from what happened within the car park, the CCTV was absolutely crucial because it demonstrated that Terry and Philip Bell were effectively on a collision course as they entered the car park.
Detectives also spot something strange about Bell's clothing as he leaves the car park.
When we suspect was the hour in which Terry was killed, he came out wearing a different pair of jeans. And we're able to identify that from CCTV because one pair was baggy and one pair was slim-fitting. So we were asking why had he changed that clothing?
Soon, investigators come up with a sinister theory.
Our theory was that he had got blood on his trousers, taken and disposed of those trousers, and changed them in that hour. Because why else? Why would you suddenly change your trousers halfway through the day?
Could this explain Bell's change of clothing? There was only one way to find out. Philip Bell is rearrested and questioned by detectives once again.
He maintained that he was not in the car park around that time on that day. He was then shown the CCTV, which put him in the car park for an hour and him leaving that car park. And he admitted then that he had been in the car park that day, and he actually admitted that he'd been in, it was called the Lonely Staircase because there was no exit from it to any main part of the car park. It was where Terry was actually killed.
But Bell is adamant he never saw Terry or took part in her attack.
Philip Bell had said during that hour between him going to the car park and him coming out of the car park, he'd been in his sleeping area smoking quite a large amount of cannabis.
What he said was that he was, his words, stoned on cannabis, which was illegal. That's why he lied to the police about where he was.
During that lost hour Bell couldn't account for, he claimed to have smoked over 7 grams of cannabis. But evidence from a drug specialist would blow holes in his story.
We were able to disprove that through the use of a drug expert who was able to analyse the CCTV of him walking in and him walking out, and saying, walking out, he was not under the influence of cannabis, such as would have been the case if he'd consumed what he said he had.
It seems the suspect who claimed he was high was walking far too steady on his feet.
He couldn't be walking in that way if he was smoking a large amount of cannabis in a short period of time.
For the team's advisors at the Crown Prosecution Service, the case against Bell is beginning to stack up.
CCTV evidence was absolutely key in this case because it provided evidence to undermine Mr. Bell's initial account that he hadn't returned to the car park, and it also gave us evidence that he changed his clothing as well during what we called the lost hour between him entering the car park with Terry and then leaving the car park after he murdered her.
Meanwhile, the forensics lab also has exciting news. an item of Bell's clothing that was seized during his first arrest, has also yielded a result.
In the CCTV of Philip Bell in Tunbridge Wells, he was wearing a very distinctive hooded top. It was a Fat Farm hoodie. And that hoodie was submitted to the laboratory for examination. And on it was a blood stain. It was a very small blood stain, about the size of a penny, that matched Terry Edmonds.
And the lab finds more evidence on Bell's belongings that were seized by police in the stairwell where he slept. On his sleeping bag, 2 large stains of blood. Through DNA testing, these are also confirmed as Terry's.
It was absolutely pivotal in the case because it demonstrated that there was a very clear link between Terry Edmonds, her being injured, and the belongings of Philip Bell and that stairwell.
To add to that, the pink sheet found near Terry's body, that's suspected of being used to smother her, throws up more clues in the forensics lab.
Not only did it have the blood of Terry Edmonds on it, but it also had a very partial footwear mark, and that footwear mark was matched to Philip Bell's training shoes. So collectively, and I suppose circumstantially, things were starting to build as a case against Philip Bell.
Is this the final nail in the coffin for the prime suspect? Forensic investigators find a semen stain on Terry's underwear. That's a partial DNA match to Philip Bell.
Today, a local man, Philip Bell, has been charged with the murder of Terry Edmonds.
With the evidence stacked against him, the 21-year-old homeless drug dealer is charged with the murder of Terry Edmonds. The news spreads through the town of Tunbridge Wells like wildfire.
It meant for the first time we could actually legally name him as the man in connection to Terry's murder.
When Philip Bell was charged, I think there was enormous relief that perhaps they had found Terry's killer. Before that, there had been a little bit of impatience from the public.
Next day, Bell appears at Sevenoaks Magistrates Court charged with Terry's killing. The scene is set for his trial at Crown Court just 3 months later.
So when there was this breakthrough and it was publicised, I think people felt finally Terry's killer will be brought to justice.
In Tunbridge Wells, 17-year-old Terry Edmonds has been found strangled and sexually assaulted, then stuffed inside a suitcase. With the evidence stacked against him, 21-year-old homeless man Philip Bell has been arrested and charged with her murder. He's spotted on CCTV following Terry into a car park, and his hoodie has a stain of blood belonging to his victim. Detectives have built up a chilling theory of how he carried out the attack.
He tried it on with her, she refused, and he then attacked her, killed her, and sexually assaulted her. But having done that, he was a homeless person with no car, he had no means to get rid of the body, but he had a suitcase. So he put the body in a fetal position in the suitcase.
A year after Terry's disappearance, Philip Bell's trial begins at Maidstone Crown Court. He pleads not guilty to her murder.
The thing that struck me about him was he was completely emotionless the whole time. You look into their eyes and there was nothing there. It was quite chilling, actually.
But as the trial progresses, police realise convincing the court of Bell's guilt may not be an open and shut case.
The case against Bell relied entirely on circumstantial evidence. There was no smoking gun, there was no witness who saw him kill Terry Edmonds.
I think that Philip Bell also had a very good defence barrister who was able to just chip away at the little bits of evidence.
It became really a massive trial. I was giving evidence for days on end.
And before long, Bell's defence team has a trick up their sleeve to try and raise doubts in the jury. They point the finger at another rough sleeper in the same car park, one of Bell's associates.
The man had a conviction for manslaughter. And because he lived in the car park, it was suggested by the defence that he was the murderer.
Not only that, but the defence's new suspect could undermine one of the team's key pieces of evidence, the footprint on the pink sheet used to smother Terry.
The man had a pair of Converse trainers found in his possession, which were linked to the pink sheet found at the scene, with a bloody footprint that matched that pair of trainers.
Following a dramatic trial lasting 6 weeks, the jury retires. After 22 hours spent deliberating, they failed to reach a verdict. For Kent Police and the prosecution team, their worst fears have come true.
All the evidence against Philip Bell, it seemed very strong. So it was very disappointing for Terry's mum, not being able to get any justice, and for the rest of her family.
With no verdict reached by the jury, the judge orders a retrial. 7 months later, a second trial begins, and a brand new jury hears the case against Philip Bell.
But again, we had the same situation, with evidence being chipped away at by the defence team.
I was thinking, oh no, not again, because I was really concerned that it would be the same Groundhog Day kind of scenario.
This time, the defence focuses on Bell's hoodie. They claim there was an innocent explanation for Terry's blood on it.
They suggested that Philip Bell had brushed past the area where Terry's blood was and got it on his top. Again, I think that what they did was they raised a doubt about that, and the jury just couldn't be sure of it.
Following 19 hours of deliberation, the jury has news.
I think it's fair to say you could cut the atmosphere in that courtroom in Maidstone Crown Court with a knife.
Once again, a jury has failed to reach a verdict.
This is another massive blow for Terry Edmonds' family. They'd sat now through 2 lengthy trials.
There was, on my part, a real sense of shock and disappointment when the jury were unable to return a verdict, and then having to decide what we were going to do.
The team is on the verge of calling it quits.
Now, if we'd done that, Bell would have walked free, and Terry's killer would never have been brought to justice.
But in a last-ditch effort to save the case, the prosecution tries for something rarely attempted in British legal history. A third trial of the same defendant.
And so we argued that it was in the interests of justice to go a third time, which is unusual.
It was the right thing to do. We had an overwhelming case, that Terry had been murdered by Philip Bell.
It's a close call, but the judge sides with the prosecution and agrees to keep Bell in custody until the retrial. So the team has one last chance to put Bell behind bars.
If the case fails, then he is going to walk free, and he could be dangerous.
So the prosecution goes back to basics. First, they tackle Bell's claim that he brushed past Terry's blood, left on the stairwell. Forensic scientists run tests using the same small amount of blood that was found on Bell's hoodie. This tiny amount would have started drying if he'd touched it after the attack.
So you can see that if the blood has started to dry quite considerably, the stains start to break up. They're quite gritty, they're quite flaky.
But the stain on Bell's top seemed fresh, questioning his version of events.
The bloodstain on the hooded top was not flaky. It was fresh-looking blood that had been transferred, so it demonstrated that it wasn't drying blood. So that blood must have transferred very quickly after it was available, which started to put Philip Bell being involved in the assault on Terry Edmonds and being exposed to her blood after she was injured.
Not only is the forensic evidence building better than before, this time the prosecution have also found a new star witness who has come forward to the police.
A 15-year-old girl came and gave her account about how she had been invited to go to the stairwell that Philip Bell was staying in.
And quite chillingly, she described what we believed had happened to Terry. Her being straddled by him and being bruised by him and him trying to assault her. But very fortunately for her, somebody came and disturbed them and she was able to escape.
That was just exactly how we imagined that the attack had taken place on Terry.
And you could hear a pin drop. It was compelling evidence, and it showed in law that he had what we call a propensity to commit this type of offence.
As the prosecution's case seems to get stronger, Bell's testimony on the stand just falls apart. He admits being on the stairwell landing at the time of Terry's attack, but says he saw nothing.
He's within 10 feet of Terry being murdered and yet sees and hears nothing. It was fanciful.
So a jury considers the evidence against Bell for a third time. Just 3 hours later, they announce their decision. Guilty.
It was a day of jubilation, really, for the family. There were loud shouts and cheers as the verdict was announced in Maidstone Crown Court.
There was an outpouring of pent-up emotion that had been there for a long period of time.
It was extremely satisfying when we were able to hear the guilty verdict and realise that we'd achieved some sort of justice for Terry's family.
Philip Bell is eventually sentenced to 28 years in jail.
He was evil. That's how the judge described him after the trial, and that is a fair description of him.
Justice is a consolation for the family, but it will never bring their beloved daughter back. Terry was a bright, intelligent girl, and she had a long life to look forward to that was cruelly taken away by Philip Bell, for no reason, really.
And the case has left its mark on the quiet Kent town of Tunbridge Wells.
I think Tunbridge Wells has never really got over the murder of Terry Edmonds, and I think the wounds are still there in Tunbridge Wells because Terry was part of our community and a lovely young woman. You could feel that fear and sadness that this had happened in our town.
In a little English village, walking her dog. These were circumstances which people would think were nightmarish.
It broke a family. It caused the most horrendous shockwaves to a community.
You could sense that a village like this wasn't used to crime of that degree.
There was no possibility that he could be tried again for that offence.
I think it gave him this powerful energy that he used to terrorise people. His behaviour was vile.
This was a historic ruling in terms of double jeopardy.
It was legally groundbreaking.
It was high stakes. This was the first in the country.
He clearly thought he'd effectively got away with it.
Ascot under Wychwood, a pretty picture postcard village that's home to just 500 residents. This peaceful, rural parish lies in the Evenlode Valley in Oxfordshire.
Ascot under Wychwood is a small village. Lots of villagers will have been here for many, many years. There will be families that have had descendants that have grown up in the village, and people know each other, that people look out for one another. It really is a tight-knit community where people generally know what's going on.
You know, if you drove through a village, you'd say, oh, this is a really nice place to live. You know, very idyllic, nice people, and a place where you perhaps also feel quite safe.
In this idyllic Oxfordshire village lives mum of two, Vicky Thompson.
Vicky was an absolutely delightful mum, wife, and, you know, loved her family, great family unit. People that came into contact with her, you know, equally found her delightful. You know, she was a lovely, kind lady.
Vicky was a key part of the village community, as many people were. People would have known her in the village, and clearly living a nice, quiet life in the Oxfordshire countryside.
She's often seen out walking her beloved dog, Daisy.
She loved the fact that she could just, you know, come out of her front door and within moments she'd be surrounded by fields, you know, with the dog and the children. So, you know, for her, I think it was a perfect place for her to bring up her family.
But Vicky's perfect idyll is about to change. Vicky had just celebrated her 9th wedding anniversary with her husband in the village pub where she worked. So on the Saturday, they take it easy, relaxing in the garden.
It was a pleasant day, the weather was beautiful, so it was a typical, you know, idyllic weekend really, that, you know, that's what families sort of strive for.
In the afternoon, Vicky decides to take collie Daisy out for a walk.
It would have been about 3:45, 4 o'clock when she set off at a regular time down the same country lane, across a little bridge over the river that ran through the village, to walk Daisy down to Shipton Lane, it was called, and to come back.
It's typical of a village lane in this sort of area, perfect for walking the dog, and I'd imagine it was a well-worn route for Vicky and many other dog walkers in the area.
But today, Vicky's dog Daisy does something quite unexpected.
The first that anyone was aware that something was wrong was when Daisy came back.
And then, unfortunately, when the dog returned without her, that's when alarm bells started to ring.
As time goes by, with no news from Vicky, concern starts to set in.
Vicky's husband went out, started looking, spoke to neighbours, spoke to friends, and then, you know, you almost naturally go into a sort of second phase of now starting to do a bit of a search, which is exactly what happened. So it sort of morphed into more of a search and thinking something's not quite right.
Vicky's husband assembles a small search team of family, friends and neighbours. They retrace her steps on her regular walk down Shipton Lane in the desperate hope of finding her.
One of those who were looking for her did notice some bloodstains on the surface of the path, but they thought that they were the blood of a sheep or something of that kind. They didn't think much of it at that time, so they went back to the village, and it was only when she still didn't return and they went back again that they looked at the bloodstain more carefully and came to realise that it was quite fresh, that beneath the congealed surface it seemed still to be wet. But much more importantly, nearby they then found some broken pieces of jewellery which were very quickly identified as hers. And that then became a source of real alarm, and I think it was that discovery which prompted the first call to the police.
Finding that jewellery, all that did was, I think, heighten the sense of nervousness within those that were looking for Vicky at the time.
As police make their way to the scene, the frantic hunt continues for Vicky. Her husband and neighbours are terrified she's clearly come to some harm. They make their way further down the lane.
This is Shipton Lane. We've got the lane itself, and then to the right you can see the train track, and they must have really panicked and must have been desperate in time to find her, and it wouldn't have taken them too long once they'd realised that she was no longer on the path to scour the local area.
3 hours after Vicky went missing, they spot something sinister.
They noticed a gap in the hedge that ran alongside the lane where the bloodstaining and the jewellery had been found. And when they went over to the gap, which led into a nearby agricultural field that was bordered by the embankment of the railway line, they could see something in the distance that looked out of place, and they made their way across the field.
And they would have found her in a bad way here.
To their horror, Vicky's lying on the ground, with blood covering her face and head. When her husband tries to speak to her, she's drifting in and out of consciousness.
She was clearly in a very bad way. He spoke of her mumbling, and he tried to keep her talking and tried to keep her coherent. I believe she could name the name of their son.
Something ominous close by suggests this is foul play.
There was a stone there nearby. She'd obviously been attacked. She was bleeding, and to discover her like that is quite a harrowing experience, really. But Vicky was found, and she was found alive.
Her husband asked her, "Who did this to you?" But he just couldn't quite make out what she was saying. She was clearly in a very bad way and clearly very seriously injured.
She was certainly not able to say what had happened, still less to identify who was responsible.
With Vicky's life hanging in the balance, an air ambulance is sent in response to airlift her from the scene.
Time was of the essence to call in an air ambulance. That must have meant that she was clearly very gravely injured. And so she was airlifted to hospital.
She's flown straight to Oxford's John Radcliffe Hospital, which specialises in treating brain injuries.
She'd suffered multiple blows with a hard object to her head, which had caused skull fractures and serious brain damage.
As police secure the crime scene, their minds turn to the violent attacker on the loose.
Had Vicky been in a position to talk, there is no doubt that she'd have said exactly who'd attacked her, because of course everyone knew everybody. Sadly, she wasn't able to do that.
With no immediate suspect in the frame, the fear of an attacker living in their tight-knit community is the talk of the village.
People think that it could have been them, that it seemingly there's no targeting, that perhaps this was just a random attack on any dog walker. It could have been them. And I think that probably did strike home to the local community and perhaps the wider community in the county and beyond.
Within the community, there's no doubt that it was colossal. You know, that fear of crime can be just as powerful. And when you've got a small community that has been completely rocked by what unfolded, there's no doubt that it impacted that community severely.
Over the next 6 days in intensive care, Vicky Thompson fights for her life.
Her condition quite quickly deteriorated, and she died a few days later. And the cause of her death was blunt force head injury.
It's the news no one in the quiet village of Ascot under Wychwood wants to hear. Vicky's violent assault has now become murder.
As a reporter, I've covered many incidences of dog walkers being attacked, and they strike a chord with people. But when it develops into a murder, then I think it really does chill people locally.
In the quiet Oxfordshire village of Ascot under Wychwood, mum of two, Vicky Thompson, has been brutally attacked whilst out walking the dog, and dies 6 days later from her injuries. With Vicky's violent killer still at large, her community and the wider public are in shock.
The profile of the case, of course, was substantially enhanced by where it took place, because this was a late summer's afternoon, a woman in a little English village walking her dog. These were circumstances which, upon reading them, people would think were nightmarish. This was not something that was supposed to happen. And I think for that combination of reasons, it very quickly attracted a great deal of publicity.
So the pressure's on for Thames Valley Police to track down Vicky's brutal attacker.
This is the area where the incident occurred, and it is typical of an Oxfordshire village. We're on the edge of the Cotswolds, and it is a lane. You can clearly see why it was popular with dog walkers. It's the kind of lane that's quite overgrown. It's the kind of area that someone who didn't want to be seen could perhaps sort of conceal themselves and look as people walked along. We've got the railway line to my right here, the embankment, which is where Vicky was found.
Since the assault, police have been sweeping the area, looking for clues that could lead to the killer.
Looking at the lane, looking at the jewellery that was found, it was a view that perhaps where she was found wasn't necessarily where she was ultimately attacked at the time.
Scenes of crime officers retrace the killer's steps, back to the bloodstains on the path where they believe the attack happened.
As with all crime scenes, that becomes the most fundamental starting point of your investigation. Because what's left behind is what you need to try and secure.
At the attack scene, clumps of blood-stained hair are found on nearby rocks.
Vicky was clearly struck about the head with a blunt instrument, potentially a rock or a stone, and clearly suffered very serious head injuries. It then appears that she was moved somehow, perhaps dragged over towards a railway line.
Although the attack happened in broad daylight, investigators have got their work cut out finding any witnesses.
This is the Cotswold line. It is a pretty quiet line. There isn't a main line. There won't be too many trains coming past at any time of day. And so no one would have really witnessed it. There wouldn't be too much passing traffic.
Police are also trying to work out why Vicky was dumped by the railway line.
Potentially moving Vicky's body or moving her unconscious body towards the embankment might have concealed what had happened, that potentially it might have been made to look like an accident, but there was no real motive put forward for why she was moved closer towards this railway embankment.
But 200 metres from the scene of the attack, officers make an intriguing find.
In a hedge was found a plastic bag which contained 2 items of ladies' underwear. that were discovered to have been contaminated with semen. This was obviously a hugely significant find, both because of what it was and because of where it took place.
Although the underwear does not belong to Vicky, it's sent off to the lab for DNA analysis. Meanwhile, police continue the hunt for potential witnesses to the attack. 2,500 people would eventually be interviewed in the surrounding area.
A huge amount of work was done. House to house was done, lots of statements taken. Because unless you start to build up a picture, you can only do that by engaging with the community. And so it was a significant, large investigation, treated as a serious investigation right from the very outset.
But in the village, one name starts coming up on the doorstep. 20-year-old, odd-job man, Mark Weston.
And there's those that, are mischievous and those that are perhaps, trouble. Mark Weston was trouble, not mischievous, he was trouble. And the investigation identified Mark Weston as a key suspect, and they had every reason to do so.
And police are told Weston is often seen on the path leading towards the crime scene, Shipton Lane.
He used to go down there. This is a chap, we've got to bear in mind, he didn't have a day job. He hanged around. So this place was a sort of regular haunt. There was lots of witnesses that would place him on this lane, because it was a regular thing for him to do.
Through door-to-door inquiries, 4 separate villagers tell police they saw Weston heading towards Shipton Lane just before the approximate time of Vicky's attack. The local post office clerk claims she saw him looking alarmed, covered in sweat, and running away from the village only an hour later.
Some witnesses had come forward and said that they'd seen him acting strangely. It became very clear, as a result of, the inquiries that went on, that Weston became a suspect.
So police pay a visit to Mark Weston. On the morning of the murder, he claims he went fishing and shopping, but was at home all afternoon during the time of the attack. 3 days later, when police question him again, his story changes, and he says he was at home all day. 5 days later, it's a different story. Weston claims he actually left his house at 5 p.m, not long after the attack, to call on his neighbours who weren't in. But Weston's neighbours beg to differ. They say they had been at home at the time Weston said he'd visited and had never seen him. For police, something doesn't stack up.
There are conflicting reports about where he was. All this sort of stuff was coming in that conflicted with what Mark was saying. It would be right to look at him very carefully. But looking very carefully is one thing. Having the evidence to support an arrest is another.
But when scenes of crime officers search his garden 4 weeks after the murder, they find the charred remains of a sweatshirt or jacket that he's attempted to burn.
As the investigation went on, other evidence started becoming apparent about, the burning of clothes. And so there's a few things that led the investigation to Mark Weston.
Today, police have arrested a 20-year-old man in the investigation into the murder of Vicky Thompson.
As the evidence builds, Mark Weston is arrested and taken in for questioning. He maintains his story, that he was at home at the time of Vicky's attack. Meanwhile, police search his house, seizing some of his clothing, including a pair of his boots. They are sent off for forensic analysis. The results come back to the senior investigating officer.
The SIO at the time asked the question, was there blood on this boot? The answer came back, no. You can't do any more with that. The question's been asked, and the answer was given.
Weston is released, and the police continue their inquiries. But soon, the lab has more news, and this time it could turn the case on its head. The lady's underwear found near the crime scene has a DNA result for the body fluids found on them. It matches Mark Weston.
That became a key piece of evidence. It linked Mark Weston to the scene, no question at all.
In Ascot under Wychwood, Oxfordshire, police have a prime suspect for the murder of mother of two, Vicky Thompson. DNA linked to Mark Weston is found in a bag of ladies' underwear close to the attack scene. With this new key evidence, police now believe they've established a motive.
He quite possibly was seen by Vicky performing a sex act and perhaps reacted angrily to Vicky, perhaps accosting him and asking him what's going on, and then things escalated from there.
I mean, would he really want the village to be aware that he was behaving like that, which was perverse activity?
I think he was threatened with humiliation and possibly worse. And I think the initial violence that he used was in temper and spontaneous. Once things start to go wrong, they get worse. And I'm afraid I think that's what happened here.
As Weston is put under the spotlight, more evidence is uncovered, linking to the bag of underwear found near the attack scene.
During a search of a narrow watercourse that ran down the back of the gardens of the houses in the street where he lived was another plastic bag in which were found other items of ladies' underwear which had been placed there or an attempt had been made to conceal them after the day of the attack. He did not want items of ladies' underwear to be found in his home which would connect him to the scene, and so he had separately disposed of those so as to prevent that connection from being made.
Although none of this underwear belonged to murder victim Vicky, police can now see Weston's trying to hide a sordid secret.
It was the underwear of women who lived in the village, and it had been taken from their washing lines, and he was using it for a sexual purpose. His reputation in the village from that day onwards would have been destroyed. I think there would have been an element of ridicule in it for him, and it might well be that he just couldn't bear the thought of that.
It seemed from the evidence that Mark Weston perhaps had a troubling relationship with women and perhaps fixated on some women locally. We will never know.
Today, a 20-year-old man has been charged with the murder of Vicky Thompson.
6 months after Vicky Thompson's brutal killing, Mark Weston is charged with her murder. Then, in November that same year, he finally faces trial at Oxford Crown Court. But before the case barely gets underway, The prosecution's dealt a serious blow.
I think the police and perhaps the Thompson family felt very aggrieved that the judge presiding over the trial ruled inadmissible some key evidence, and that was that bag found with 2 pieces of underwear containing DNA from Weston very near the scene. That was ruled inadmissible. The jury couldn't know about that.
With little other evidence proving Weston's inappropriate sexual behaviour, the judge believes this one piece of proof could unfairly sway the case.
The judge felt it just wasn't fair for Weston that he would get a fair trial if that was admitted. And I've got no doubt having that judge make that direction would have been hard to be accepted. But the law is there to protect everybody, whether you're a victim or an offender, to make sure, from an offender's perspective, that you get a fair trial.
But police have now lost their vital evidence linking Weston to the crime scene.
And so a key bit of evidence, a key bit of fact-finding from the police was ruled out at a stroke.
It is unfortunate that that wasn't admitted as evidence. It would have been crucial. It would have significantly helped the Crown's case.
As the trial continues, the prosecution case never recovers.
There have always been discrepancies and inconsistencies in the accounts which he gave at the time about his movements, but none of that was sufficient to prove an opportunity for him to have been where she was in order for him to have carried out the attack. And in the absence of a piece of evidence which could clearly establish that, it was always going to be difficult.
Following a trial lasting 14 days, the jury retires to consider the case. To the court's surprise, they return in just 50 minutes. The verdict? Mark Weston is not guilty. It's a body blow for the police and Vicky's family.
An acquittal in 50 minutes or so is fairly rare in my experience, and so clearly the jury in that original trial just didn't feel there was the evidence there to convict Mark Weston.
An acquittal so quickly after retirement was interpreted as a declaration of innocence, a statement by the jury not merely that it hadn't been proved that it was him, but that it very definitely wasn't him.
It is very disappointing when a jury does come back and return a verdict of not guilty, when you know and you strongly believe that that person is guilty.
The case was thrown out very quickly, and so the police and Thompson's family and friends clearly walked away from the Crown Court that day very disappointed indeed.
They made their decision at the time that had to be accepted.
Mark Weston even appears on local news to boast about his acquittal.
Cleared of murder, Mark Weston is this morning back with his family.
Well, I've done nothing wrong, but they still kept saying it was me, knowing it wasn't. But now they've come to realise they had the wrong person.
And to add salt to their wounds, Thames Valley Police comes under fire from the unlikeliest of places.
Following the acquittal, one of the jurors felt sufficiently strong about what they had observed during those proceedings to write directly to Mr. Weston, suggesting that he might sue the Thames Valley Police for a wrongful prosecution.
Although Weston secures legal aid to do this, his case runs out of steam. So he turns to other ideas of how to seek revenge.
There's a thought that you might quietly just go back and just be perhaps under the radar. Weston was none of that. When he got acquitted, I think he had a sense of empowerment.
He acted with impunity after that. He moved back into the community and he taunted the community perhaps in some ways and literally harassed people who'd been involved in that original trial. He didn't try to fade away.
Barely a year later, Weston launches a campaign of harassment against the village bobby who helped investigate the case. Day and night, he makes up to 50 silent phone calls to the PC, his wife and their 2 daughters.
He terrorised the officer. And bearing in mind, that's how we policed. You know, we're in that community. We're part of the community because you are a member of the village. And I've been there. And it's lovely. But the thought of them being terrorised is just harrowing.
After police put video surveillance on the village phone box and record Weston's phone calls, he's convicted for harassment. Weston is sentenced to a 2-year conditional discharge and a restraining order. So next, Weston moves on to another villager who also provided evidence in his murder case.
I believe he put some posters up around the village and he made remarks about people being a grass, and clearly he went on the offensive.
Weston shines lights into his neighbour's house and posts threatening notes through her door. Mark Weston is convicted of harassment once again. He's sentenced to 100 hours of community service.
This empowerment, I think, overwhelmed him. So he became very vexatious. I am permitted to do this because actually I've been acquitted. I think it gave him this powerful energy that he used to terrorise people. His behaviour was vile.
He was perhaps a little bit arrogant. He didn't feel that he was under any threat from being hauled back to court. The law at the time meant that he couldn't be retried for the same offence, and so he clearly thought he'd effectively got away with it.
But a change of law on the horizon would soon give the investigators new hope.
Why? Because we knew, without question, that Mark Weston killed Vicky.
Ascot under Wychwood, Oxfordshire. In spite of proof linking Mark Weston to the murder of villager Vicky Thompson, he's acquitted in court. And the so-called double jeopardy law means Weston will never face justice again, even if new evidence comes to light.
It was a horrific attack, and her family must have been deeply troubled by no one having been convicted of her murder.
But in 2003, there's fresh hope.
Parliament passed an act which abolished the common law rule of double jeopardy, permitting, in limited circumstances, the prosecution for a second time of the same individual for the same offence.
2 years later, on the 10th anniversary of Vicky's tragic murder, Thames Valley Police's cold case review team reopens the investigation, with then Detective Superintendent Barry Halliday leading the unit.
That was typically one of the cases that was immediately identified as needing to be reviewed.
That didn't mean it was easy for prosecutors to bring another case. It was, in fact, there was a very high bar for the prosecution to succeed. They'd also need compelling, fresh, new evidence. They knew that a murderer had walked free after that initial trial, and they just needed that one piece of evidence to get him, to nail him, to get their man.
The light bulb moment for investigators comes from another high-profile case that hit the headlines 5 years earlier. The murder of Peckham schoolboy, Damilola Taylor.
The senior police officer was attending a lecture on how, upon the first investigation of the death of that little boy, highly incriminating bloodstains had not been detected upon items of clothing being examined by scientists during the investigation, and how difficult it is sometimes to find them.
So detectives try and hunt down any of Weston's belongings that weren't returned to him following the first investigation. They're in luck. Weston's boots are found in one of the Force's exhibit stores. Could they contain that golden nugget of proof police desperately need?
There was no harm in sending those boots back in. Fresh pair of eyes, fresh forensic opportunities, and testing and examination, and just be sure that there was no forensics on those boots.
In the 10 years since the boots last saw the light of day, forensic techniques have massively evolved.
The changes in procedures for searching for blood would involve a change in the sorts of lights that we regularly use. We now use a fibre optic lamp, and that has a halogen bulb in it. Previously, people just used perhaps an overbench light with a tungsten bulb in it. And we know that that change in lighting is much better for looking for bloodstains. The other change is that we will more regularly use a low-power microscope to search an item for blood, whereas previously that wasn't routinely used.
So scientists put Mark Weston's boots under the microscope to see if the tiniest spot of blood had been missed the first time round. The fact that they are black proves to be the greatest challenge.
People think of bloodstains as being bright red. Well, they are when they're fresh, but they very quickly change their appearance. They darken.
The blood doesn't show up readily on a black surface. There are also lots of nooks and crannies, and it has a very intricate surface, so it's a difficult item to examine, and I think even a careful and diligent scientist could miss blood if they weren't examining it under optimum conditions.
But soon, forensic scientists hit the jackpot.
We found some blood staining on Mark Weston's boots, and DNA profiles were obtained from that blood, and those matched Vicky Thompson. That was really the significant moment in this case. It was the turning point.
It's the news the cold case team have been longing for.
The case was never closed, and to get a moment like that where you're told that all that hard work that your team has ploughed into evidence is euphoric.
They'd finally found that smoking gun, that real piece of evidence that they needed to seal the conviction that they thought they should have sealed years earlier.
After 4 years spent rebuilding their case, police swoop in to rearrest Mark Weston.
He was absolutely, frankly furious. He was adamant, arrogant. Can't believe this is happening to me again. That sort of behaviour. So all the evidence was presented to him, including the overwhelming evidence of the blood of Vicky on his own boots. Absolutely no response from him at all, accepting any responsibility or liability for Vicky's death. A complete and utter denial.
But the police aren't home and dry with a prosecution yet. Next, they have to convince a court of appeal. And these are uncharted waters. It's one of the first times a double jeopardy case has been heard before the court.
Our case was made very strongly, and then there is that huge sense of nervousness whilst you're waiting for the decision.
After weeks of waiting, police and prosecutors finally get news.
Given how compelling the evidence was, the Court of Appeal made the decision that it was in the interests of justice for Mr. Weston to be tried again, and his acquittal was quashed.
That was agonising, waiting. But the news came back. You are elated.
It was a great moment when we heard that the Court of Appeal had overturned the acquittal. This was a historic ruling in terms of double jeopardy and introducing new scientific evidence.
5 months later, Weston finally hears the murder case against him for a second time.
There was a real sense that Thames Valley Police had been given a second chance here, and so there was a sense of tension that the police were gambling in a sense that this was their final throw of the dice.
It was high stakes. The tension was immense, and Weston continued to be as arrogant as ever.
But this time, the discovery of underwear near the crime scene linked to Weston is allowed to be heard in court. It's clear even he can't explain away the overwhelming evidence against him.
There wasn't going to be much anybody could do about the fact that her blood was found on his boots. The scientific evidence this time round was simply unanswerable.
Perhaps he knew that his time was finally up, and that last piece of evidence was crucial, and he couldn't fight this any longer.
Shorty, if you really wanna go, baby, then you gotta take me the mess. I tried to soak in all the years and take it all in, but I come up for a breath and cry. I gave my drama, gave my simple, gave my friends a helping hand. I bet you know that they are dead. I wish I could tell you this. The more we talk, the talk is not a tongue. The more we talk, the talk is not a tongue. I did not come this far for any stronger. All of a sudden there was nothing left. Well, last night a doctor thought you were lying. I never meant to keep you alive. There might be stuff we said that sound dumb to you, but to get a red wine and take it with a lid, I bet you know that they are dead. I wish I could tell you this. The more we talk, the talk is not a tongue. The more we talk, the talk